Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. What to do before the acquisition, insights and real life examples of how to get it right and sometimes how to get it wrong. Today, we're going to be speaking with Bill Lenihan. He's an industry leader with Hartman Executive Advisors, and George Nemphos, co-founder and managing director of Nemphos Braue. And together, we're going to discuss what's going on in this really hot M&A market. We're going to hit topics like reasons acquisitions fail. We're going to give some good examples of best practices, what works and what doesn't, some must-dos around due diligence, how to make your attorney and your law firm your strategic partner, and really the role that IT plays in value creation. Certainly, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our very best to get to them. So a couple housekeeping items before we start. Our sponsors today are Hartman Executive Advisors and Nemphos Braue. Hartman Executive Advisors is an independent leadership firm that works with mid-market executives to strengthen the role that IT plays in supporting their business goals. Now, when it comes to M&A, Hartman assists clients in pre- and post-deal understanding of just how IT impacts valuation. They help companies treat M&A like a business strategy rather than a transaction, and they assist them in planning, IT strategy, due diligence, vendor selection, technology selection, contract negotiation, security, and communications. Now, Nemphos Braue is a proven expert and dedicated to their clients in all forms of law. The attorneys are accomplished and counselors in all areas of corporate law, and they offer this big firm experience with boutique service and a focus on being strategic business partners to their clients, from venture capital, private equity and financing to M&A, intellectual property, cannabis, general counsel solutions. Nemphos Braue is a different kind of law firm, supporting entrepreneurs, emerging and mature companies. And I'm Marty O'Neill. I'm a managing director with Chesapeake Corporate Advisors. We're a lower middle market corporate advisory and investment banking firm. And my background personally is having gone through 3 deals as an operator and dozens really as a consultant, an advisor, an executive with private equity, and an advisor with an M&A firm. I'm joined today by Bill Lenihan. Bill's an industry leader at Hartman with 30 years of business, IT, and M&A experience. Bill's worked in industry and consulting, has played a strategy and M&A leadership role with Accenture and North Highland. He's helped his clients on strategic development, pre-transaction diligence, integration, and working with clients that are in strategy development, target identification, due diligence, post-merger acquisition, and all the phases associated with that. I'm also joined by George Nemphos. George is a founding member of his law firm and super experienced in leading M&A deals, including spin-offs, roll-ups, acquisitions, and joint ventures of all sizes, representing venture capital, private equity funds, and independent sponsors, and advising in capital raises to help companies scale their businesses. George holds an LLM from Georgetown and a JD from University of Baltimore. Well, gentlemen, the M&A market space is very active, and that may be an understatement. Transaction volume is at a record level. Transaction values, and that may say something around valuations, is ever increasing. Debt's at a sort of an all-time industry low. There's an unprecedented amount of dry powder in the marketplace, and the role of private equity just seems to escalate. So, George, I'm gonna go to you first. You and your firm have been involved in literally dozens of transactions on the buy side and the sell side, and many of those on the call today are going to be at all stages of a transaction, considering liquidity options, exploring different ways of thinking about things pre-deal, maybe even post-deal integration. Can you talk a little bit about the gap that exists between strategy and execution? Some of the things that you've seen, maybe some of the best practices, and maybe things that operators should stay away from.
Sure, Marty, and thank you today for coming on and moderating this panel, and thank you to Hartman for being a co-sponsor. You know, it's a great question, and actually, I think I would have to say that you have to start even before the transaction occurs. It's really in the pre-transaction planning phase that you need to have your eye on the ball. Quite frequently an M&A acquisition target looks terrific. You are all excited about it and you can see a potential for tremendous growth or incremental value to the organizations. But without proper planning and without proper due diligence and frankly structuring, you immediately put yourself behind the eight ball as you proceed down the integration path and realizing that value. Quite frequently, we will see even the experienced acquirers stumble out of the block and thus, be behind in the race the entire time. And if you become behind in the race, then you're not going to be able to get the value. So first and foremost, your strategic planning needs to occur prior to the transaction even occurring. And that should flow through your due diligence if you're the buyer, and with an eye towards how you're going to go about integrating and realizing the value that you believe that you can obtain by doing the transaction. And from the seller standpoint, the same thing kind of goes. You need to make sure your house is in order, so that way it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to assist and promote, if you will, the handoff of the baton in the race to winning, the value that you are hoping that you can win. Quite frequently, we will see buyers and sellers have a disconnect, if you will, as to what that really means and what it takes to get there. So integration planning should commence prior to even doing the acquisition. And quite frequently, you'll find that planning is an offshoot of the strategic targeting and planning that you're making for where you want to take the new company or the target post-acquisition. So, we quite frequently find that when the integration or the planning hasn't taken place, the strategic value quickly drops. Even if it's just a one-off acquisition, if there's a transaction in which somebody's looking to get into the market and they're acquiring a company, sometimes we refer to that as a platform company, a company in which you make an acquisition and believe that you can do bolt-on acquisitions to make something even bigger. But if you don't have the planning in place and you haven't cleaned your house going into it and you haven't come up with a strategic customer plan, operational plan, and financial plan, the value that you are trying to tie back to and that you believe you actually acquired goes away extremely quickly.
Yeah. Bill, can you follow up on that? George talked about planning and execution and the different areas, operational, even legal and structural. What role does IT play in this? For example, George mentioned the platform and integrating or bolting on additional companies onto that. IT must play a major role in value preservation or even value increase, once the deal is done. So what do you guys see in the role that IT plays in all of this?
Sure, Marty, and thanks for having me and the Hartman team. It's interesting, if you look at the pressures from inflation, supply chain disruptions, the great resignation, the exploding technology market, and of course, continued pressures from boards and investors, 2022 is going to be quite a year for IT organizations. So what do you have to do pre-deal? On the buy side, IT needs to be an enabler of integration efficiency. So you have to enable the organization to drive a very efficient, high velocity integration. To do that, it's important to really, as George says, clean your house, prepare and really clean the IT foundation. For example, dust off your M&A playbook and confirm it's still relevant. Some people have playbooks from a decade or two ago, and they're just not relevant in today's market if it's not updated. Also, it's important that everyone in the organization understands their role throughout this transaction and how they're going to contribute. So there needs to be that alignment. Second, you have to establish some governance process for decision making. Now, we've got a client that is highly acquisitive. And when you mention governance to them, they view it as kind of a weighty, dense process. It doesn't have to be a handcuff. right? And so in that case, for highly acquisitive organizations, you might look at a governance process that is really manifests itself as a set of guiding principles for efficient decision-making, and decision-making that can be fairly autonomous. If you constantly go back to those guiding principles, then you don't need a weighty governance process. You've got a very nimble, very light, decision-making process that really allows you to integrate at speed. The third thing I'd mention is standardize and simplify your IT environment. We walk into so many environments with multiple different transaction systems, different versions of transaction systems, different email systems, reporting and analytical tools. Clean your house, standardize and simplify that organization, that set of technology capabilities, because once simplified, it makes integration much faster.
Yeah.
And takes away some of those risks. The fourth thing I'd mention is establish some guiding principles for integration, right? Have a framework. So depending on the target, know what your IT integration process is going to entail. So for example, if you've got a small subscale organization with a low degree of IT synergy, you might just use an adoption strategy where you let the old technology run off, let the people come on board.
Okay.
Conversely, if you've got a scale organization where synergy is high, you'd have to do a rationalization approach. But understand that, define that in advance, so that as you move forward with the transaction, you're not going through the process of having to define that in real time.
Gotcha. Excellent. George, I think, and we probably both will agree that selling your company can be an exhaustive process, right? And then all of a sudden, especially if you're a platform company, after that, you've got to continue to build and continue to manage stakeholders and continue to integrate. So from the companies you've worked with, maybe from a legal perspective or an operational perspective, what do you consider as the synergies or the ways that value doesn't diminish, after that? Because again, I just know these C-levels, it's hard work to sell. And then now you're the platform company and you're building and you've got new stakeholders, you got private equity that you never had to deal with before, and you've got a variety of companies. What are the best practices from a legal perspective around the synergies of integrating all that and making it work and then continuing to create value as these companies continue to acquire?
Sure. I mean, it does start before the transaction closes, right? So planning. When you're walking into a situation in which you're going to be onboarding new management, new employees, new customers, potentially new products, new locations, as Bill said, new IP, new IT, you need to have a good solid plan. And that comes from not only the business side, but the legal side. Bill mentioned about how when you're planning from an IT standpoint, you need to have a roadmap. You need to take an inventory of what you have, cut out the clutter and streamline it to make it more simplistic. In that situation, the IT and the simplicity of the IT can actually assist and promote the integration. From a lawyer's standpoint, you're hoping that the due diligence that was completed prior to the execution of the documents, and then actually the structure of the transaction itself, will lend to being able to integrate, preserve value, and start the process of having that value increase the very next day. A lot of this can be done through structural issues, ensuring that the chain of command is properly laid out, the employment contracts, the non-competes, the non-solicitations, the non-disclosures, all those good items are in place to promote continuity and quite frankly, consolidation of interests. Lawyers and your advisors, including accountants and IT, can help the company, and in your case, as you mentioned, a platform company, prepare itself to create an onboarding process which is able to be replicated each time they go off and acquire somebody. And therefore, as you do that, the team is able to replicate that in their own interactions with new people. And so there's much more of a cohesive approach to moving it forward. So if you're able to build a structure that promotes continuity, you're gonna protect value in the long run.
Yeah.
You know, the first 30, 60, 90, 120 days in any post-acquisition are probably the most important. It's when you need to take everything you learned from the due diligence standpoint and everything that you built, and you're off down the race. And you need to utilize those items to garner, you know, trust amongst your new employees, cohesiveness amongst the old and new, but also utilize it so that way, as you're moving out and talking with customers and third parties, it becomes seamless. You know, your lawyer should not create a structure, both operational and legal as to the whole, that makes it impossible for you to operate going forward. You know, to Bill's point, simple is always better. Unfortunately, as we all know, lawyers don't like anything simple. But, you know, while it may not appear simple, the end result of the structure and the legal advice and the guidance that you have throughout the process should enable for a simple operation. And so that is really the way post-closing and during the integration process that you can preserve value and actually get accretive value. It's the planning. It's the structural analyses that have occurred that allow you to be seamless outside. You're going to trip. You're going to fall. In my race analogy, if you're trying to jump a hurdle, you are going to catch a foot on a hurdle. I guarantee you. Everybody does. Yeah. It's whether or not the work that was put in structurally and organizationally is solid enough and easy to follow, such that you can pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and really not lose your place in the race.
I really like the kind of the game plan of integration. And Bill and I talked about this the other day on the phone, is sort of that initial 30, 60, 90, 120 days of integration. Bill, can you follow up on that? And are there processes that are more key than others? Should we integrate finance before we integrate the sales team? Before HR? Is anything more important than the other? And what have you seen some best practices, or maybe even some scary situations around that? And what is the golden window? Is it the first 180 days? What is it like?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically organizations look to integrate the their financials. They want to get that right out of the gate. After that, it's really a function of where the focus is, right? Is it really about revenue growth? If it's about revenue growth, take care of your customers, take care of your sales force. Let's make sure we're doing everything to preserve and retain both, because that's a fast path to making a transaction dilutive, is losing your customers and losing your sales force. Focus on what you do best and what's the most important. If you're a manufacturer or a financial firm, focus on those areas that are most important to your operation to get them up and running. It's that entire process. It's the first 30, 60, 90, 180 days, but knowing what you have to do across that time horizon, setting your priorities, getting your organization aligned on what has to get done, and then executing quickly and collaboratively. I mean, that's where, in that time frame, where organizations can stumble, as George said, it's, you're going to catch a foot on a hurdle. I like the analogy because that's exactly what happens in that short time. There are delays in the process, that you haven't done your diligence on data. You haven't done your diligence to make sure you understand kind of the data within your organization and how that relates to the data on the target side. In terms of looking at things that you need to be doing, certainly if it's a platform acquisition, what's really important is predictability of demand and a forecast that works. Right. So if you're on the acquired side, one of the things you want to do is make sure that you're looking at establishing that capability for a predictive demand forecast. And there are tools that people use with AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning. Those don't happen overnight. right?
Yeah.
Those are things that you need to, with a 3 to 5 year horizon, you can start planning for that, getting those tools up and learning so that they can start driving the value on day one.
Gotcha.
Scalability. You got to make sure that the solutions are scalable. So knowing, for example, you acquire an organization with technology that that only works in one facility or only works for a single use application. If you're a platform play, you know that that's not going to fly. So really establishing a game plan then that that allows you to scale and to scale to multiple facilities, multiple locations, multiple uses. And then, as I mentioned before, customer engagement and retention. You've got to be obsessive about your customer engagement. And so really doing what you can do to drive stickiness and understanding that value proposition for customers, making sure that you're paying attention to it and doing things with technology like e-commerce and omni-channel strategies that help you kind of surround that customer base and protect them and preserve them as you go through integration.
Yeah, there's an irony there. I mean, I put my old operator hat back on, Bill, and I keep thinking those are all great strategies just for operating a company. That just the stickiness of a client, the simplicity of your IT, the streamlining, the making sure you're obsessive about your customers, all great advice. George, I'm going to flip the script just a little bit and think in terms of selling entities, companies that are maybe a couple years out from a liquidity event. We deal with those all the time in our advisory practice, and some are more open than others to sort of input and advice on kind of what they want to be. So, as a friend of mine in the corporate advisory world used to say, you want to be in the glide path of as many people as you can be when you do enter the market. So, what do you say to companies that are a year or two out from maybe a planned liquidity event? Are there things that they should be working on, everything from their corporate structure to just getting their house in order? Are there some specifics that they should be working on in order for them to be the most attractive person when they enter the market?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Marty alluded to it, and you're right on the money, and that is clean your house. It is time to paint, repair, and bury the dead bodies in your neighbor's yard. I mean, it is. I mean, if that's the dream scenario for a lawyer. I mean, honestly, someone comes to you 24 months in advance and says, hey, I'm going to sell in 2 years or start the process in 18 months. I'd really like to get myself in a good position. That's like a dream scenario. I like to call them unicorn clients. They don't exist for the most part. But it's never too late for the most part to start the process. But the process really is you need to clean house and you need to get yourself in an organizational position that you can respond to requests and put your best foot forward. When you buy a house or you go to sell your house, the real estate agent comes in and says, paint that, fix this, declutter this, move this around, make yourself more presentable. It's the same thing for a company, but it's just more down to the ideas of corporate legal structure. Are you properly structured for an advantageous tax result for yourself and potentially the buyer, excuse me. Some personal housekeeping. Do you have estates and trust planning issues? Is everything properly delineated? Who owns it? Clean out your records. Anything 10, 15 years old, you really don't need to have lying around and cluttering up your ability to be responsive. Examine your contracts, both your customer and your supplier contracts, so you really understand the terms and conditions of those and do an assessment as well as an inventory. So that way you can very quickly respond and you can very quickly know what those terms and conditions are. I tell clients all the time that if you're going to head into the market to be sold, you really want to make sure that your contracts, to the extent you're capable of doing this and frankly, your industry lends itself to it, is you want those contracts to try to be at least 18 months, out from after the sale, because that goes to valuation. You don't end up, getting, what I call dinged on the valuation because they're looking at it saying, well, that revenue is only really good for another 6 months. Or they come back to you and say, we want you to go negotiate with your customer or your supplier to get an extension to the agreement. That's not where you want to be in the middle of selling your company, is trying to renegotiate terms or getting them longer. Take the time, do it early on. Take the time to put yourself in a position that you can respond quickly, you're organized, as many dead bodies are found in your neighbor's yard, and that you're capable of demonstrating not only your historical value, but your future value. And that latter point can tend to get lost on a seller. I'm being bought for what I've done and what I bring, and I want to be paid based upon that. Plus, I want you to pay me because it's going to keep doing that in the future.
Yeah.
You may actually be undercutting yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think to that extent, the lawyer getting in and helping review your positioning, helping you get organized, understanding where you are, understanding the risks associated with it, and helping you document it so you walk into something ahead of the game. You got to do it on the finance side too.
Oh, yeah.
And I know, and Bill knows that a few years back, everybody's like, no, just have your reviewed or your audited financials up and let them do the quality of earnings check. Today, no, you're better off doing the quality of earnings check yourself. Yes, it costs some more money, but then it becomes perfunctory and the buyers are reviewing, analyzing, and acknowledging what the Q of E you already did is doing. So it really is about, Marty, taking that time in advance to prepare your company, yourself, and your employees for what's coming ahead.
Yeah, that's great. So I was thinking about a recent situation that we've run into, and I think you can both address it. And it's really the securing of intellectual property. It was in Bill, in this case, it's software, and how does that software proprietary to the selling entity? Now, how does it maintain its value through the whole process, and how to convince people? So, as a seller, Bill, when people are developing or have product that they take into the market, software, and in this case, there's intellectual property associated with it. Is there something they should be working on for a product that will convey to a buyer? And then maybe we'll come back to George and talk about maybe the securing of the intellectual property itself. So, Bill, what about the technology piece of it? Should they be doing things, or what should they be doing around making sure that their product is something that's of value going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And certainly there's a lot on the legal side that I'll let George handle. But, it's interesting. We have a number of clients that are in a position where they believe they have differentiated technology and they want to preserve it. The first thing you have to do is, trust but verify. Is this truly differentiated technology? Yeah. Understand how it's positioned relative to other products on the market. So if it is truly differentiated, if it's truly intellectual property that adds value, you have to define it, define the value proposition, define what part of the value chain it impacts. Is it a customer side impact? Does it help you, for example, have a better win rate on bids if you compete in bids? Is it something that helps you drive a manufacturing process, for example, that other organizations don't have? So you have to be able to identify it, classify it, quantify it in terms of its impact, so that you can position it as a unique piece of capability. Mm-hmm. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, a number of companies that we've worked with believe they have this differentiated asset. And what it is it's a capability new to them, perhaps, but not new in the market. And it's something that could easily be replicated. There's no real exit barriers in the technology. It's easy to replace. It's available on the shelf. It's important to be honest and to bring that level of integrity to your client and say, okay, how do you really compare against these things that are available? But for
Yeah.
things that are truly uniquely differentiated, identify, classify, categorize, and monetize, you have to be able to define that on all of those dimensions.
George,
And then,
can
of
you
course, the
go
legal
ahead?
side
Sorry,
with
Bill.
George. No, that's all right. I was just going to turn it over to George and let him
Gotcha.
deal with the legal side of it.
So Bill, George, can you add on to that? And I'm thinking of my mind discussions I've had with clients in the past that, to Bill's point, they think it's a real product. Maybe it's an add-on to a service. It's not really listed on the balance sheet as an asset. So what do we need to be talking to our clients about, and when they think they have a product, or they might, it just might not be something that, as Bill say, is defensible in the marketplace.
You know, so from a legal standpoint, trademark, trade name, copyright, patentability, trade secret.
Boom.
Okay. You kind of have to do an assessment right up front. What am I looking at? Okay. And am I going to try to treat it like a trade secret and be Coca-Cola and lock away the secret formula in a vault for 75 years, never share it with anybody else, so that way they never can find it, and therefore I basically control it forever? It's a rarity that you actually find that happening, especially in today's marketplace when it comes to software, where people are using open source code, which is a whole nother issue that drives acquirers nuts when they're dealing with products that are based on open source coding. You know, when you're headed into the acquisition and you're doing your housekeeping and your analyses of where parts of your company are, you know, to Bill's point, it's very important that you take a look at this. And there are different ways to protect different things. So to the extent it's actually a product and you dive into the pieces to see if there's anything patentable within the product, maybe you end up patenting a little piece within that product, thereby protecting the product at whole and being able to give yourself a step up. Potentially, there's nothing patentable. You've just amalgamated 9 different things that other people are doing in the marketplace, and you slightly do them differently.
Yeah.
It's not probably going to be patentable, but you've got a hell of a logo, hell of a product name, and hell of a marketing channel. So let's make sure you've trademarked your logo, your product name, your copyrighted your materials. Those are all things that you can do to indirectly protect value of your underlying product. Licensing agreements, to the extent that you have licenses for certain technology or for inclusion within your products, let's make sure they're locked down. And if to the extent you can make them exclusive, let's make them exclusive. You know, frequently, you know, companies who have a lot of patents do it because they've been told to. They don't really have a strong analysis of, is it something that's worthwhile patent, or would I have been better off trying to keep a secret sauce? That being said, a lot of companies out there in the marketplace, if it smells patentable, they'll file, because it's always nice as part of your sale process, if you're selling, to be able to say, oh, we have a patent. Now, that patent may not cover everything you're doing. It may cover only one piece, but maybe it covers the piece that's integral to all the other pieces. So you really got to take a step back and examine, you know, all the different types of intellectual property that you may have and how they came to be, and ensure yourself that you've done what you need to do to corral that and put it in a place that it looks like it can be packaged up as something unique, or at least something that's protected that a buyer will ascribe value to. You know, just because it would fall under the legal definition of intellectual property doesn't mean it has value. Right. So you really got to dig in a little bit to figure out what has value and what doesn't. And to the extent that you need to put lipstick, I don't want to say on the pig, but if you put lipstick, you know, on the puppy, you know, you put a little lipstick on it and, you know, do a little dance.
Yeah, got it. So in our audience today, we have a variety of companies, small, middle market, different segments of the market, private equity, sort of capital crowds here. Bill, can you talk a little bit about what Hartman Advisors sees sort of in this the space between companies that will be considered bolt-ons, add-ons, and then maybe companies that might be considered as platform companies. In our world, maybe just using as example for us would be maybe use 40 million in revenue as a number between, under that is a bolt-on, over that's potential add-on. And there's lots of stuff that can go in that. But can you talk a little bit about technology and core processes that are going to be required as a platform company? Because we have this dialogue all the time, but it's a small company. We'd like to be a platform. Well, it's just not that attractive as a platform. There's a variety of reasons. But from a technology standpoint, maybe a core processes, Bill, what do you see as sort of key to a platform entity that private equity would be interested in them for that?
So sure, I think at kind of a core capability is transaction processing, regardless of the industry you're in. I spend a lot of my time in manufacturing, distribution, logistics, and retail. And in that space, having an ERP that is robust. And as a platform play, I think I mentioned earlier, it needs to be scalable. So you've got a robust set of transaction processing capabilities. If you're in a warehousing environment, it's a WMS, and you're in logistics, it's a TMS. So that core transaction processing system has got to be one that's highly scalable. One question that comes to mind when we talk about scalability is, are we talking about multiple facilities across a market? Or are we talking about, because we do have companies in that range that want to look outside the borders of the US, look north to Canada, look east to Europe. So what kind of environment do you need to have? What kind of capabilities do you need to have to scale at that level? So again, robust set of core transaction processing. Now, the transaction processing systems in and of themselves can be dilutive to earnings. So we don't want to just focus on that. We want to focus on the areas that drive real tangible value. And those tend to be kind of technology innovations on the edge. So how are we engaging with customers? How are we engaging with the market? Do we have the ability to manage demand and predict demand? I think I mentioned earlier kind of demand forecasting using some technologies using AI and machine learning. Those are going to have a substantial impact on the business and on the value that's created, because it gives a much better view for, as a platform company, a much more predictive view of what revenues are going to look like moving forward. Makes planning a lot easier. We look at, and I mentioned e-commerce and omnichannel as a way of kind of creating that stickiness for organizations, but looking at, how do I surround my core transaction systems with capabilities on the edge using, for example, Internet of Things, IoT devices, robotics? What are the things that we can do to combat, for example, the Great Resignation? We've got a significant employment gap, right, in many aspects of the industries in which I serve. How are we, in the past, organizations looked at robotics as a threat. Now it's almost a mandate, because they can't get the people they need to do the work that has to be done. So they're looking at more technology innovations on the edge, looking at robotics to play key roles where in the past it had been done by people. So now we're automating more and more of the people-intensive, manually intensive processes. And then looking to a general category of analytics to drive new insights into your business. How do you bring inputs from market data, research organizations, your operational data, any kind of competitive data, and news from around the world? How do I integrate all of this outside information into my organization in such a way that I can derive new insights and really, as a platform play, become a real high growth, high potential organization?
Got it. Thank you. So we have some input from the audience. And I'll throw this over to you, George. The question was around different acquiring entities have different interests. This was asking us to contrast private equity with a family office. Now, why would a family office acquire an entity versus maybe a private equity or a strategic? What would make them more attractive to that crowd?
You know, it's an interesting question. Family offices, for the audience, are really wealthy families. I think, you know, you've heard about them out throughout, you know, the United States and abroad. These are families that effectively have said, we're going to take our capital and put it to work ourselves. We're going to hire our own teams to go off and find, you know, acquisition targets, investments. And we're not going to go to the private equity funds, the venture funds, the Bear Stearns, the JP Morgans, the Deutsche Banks, the whatnot. You know, we want to do it ourselves. And the thing you have to realize or remember is the following. A private equity fund is generally an entity that was created by a group of individuals with some sponsors to which they have what we call a blind pool of money. And the blind pool of money goes out and finds companies to buy. And they buy these companies. Well, there's a horizon on the fund, meaning they can't hold the companies forever. They need to build and sell themselves. So if you're selling to a private equity fund, you need to be ready and understand that there's additional pressures that will be placed upon you potentially if you stay on with a company to create that value, because the private equity fund bought your company expecting some sort of growth in value to return to their own investors. And frankly, not in a very long period of time, 3 to 5 maximum. A strategic competitor per se is looking to take you out of the market and get as much as they can, you know, from your company. There could be some really high value there because they're looking to acquire you to expand their own footprint. And as such, you know, there's synergies that they feel that they can leverage that a private equity fund, which needs to buy you with all the procedures and the populace in place, a strategic could buy you and, sorry to say it this way, strip away some of your G&A and overhead, incorporate it into their own company, and immediately gain additional, you know, return on capital for the investment, and then leverage it potentially with other services that they provide. Family offices are unique. You know, generally speaking, a family office doesn't have a horizon. They're willing to invest in the long haul. They're looking for somebody they trust and they can partner with. So they're more likely not to want to buy your company outright and have you go off into the good night. They're more likely to want to buy a significant portion, a majority portion, if not a super majority portion of your company, and have a structure in place where you're still involved and still own a piece for a period of time. And then allow the company over the time period to build, grow, and morph into something new and different and hopefully more successful. Honestly, most of the time, family offices are a little bit more forgiving if things go a little south at times. Yeah, I mean, they know they need the management team. They know that they need the input and the infrastructure in order for the company to continue on. They will use their people to supplement the company's management team and structure, but they're counting on the management team to grow forward. So they're more of a true, most of the time, they're more of a true partner. Not all the time. Sometimes they're very finance oriented, but most of the time, if not, you know, majority of the time, it's a much different relationship. So we find a lot of times sellers who kind of in between being a bolt-on and a platform company,
Yeah.
you know, they like the family offices. You know, when they're going through the process, they want to talk to family offices because they realize there's going to be an influx of not only capital in the transaction, but more brain power, and highly probable that they're going to have individuals or a group that has some experience tangentially or directly in the industry of the company. So you're getting an extra set of hands from a partner who wants you to succeed.
Yep.
And so it really is, I mean, it really is a different way of looking at things. So when someone's looking to sell their company, you need to think about, are you going to stick around? Are you willing to what we call roll over some of your equity and continue on as a small shareholder in the future company? Or do you want to just get out? And, as you're making those decisions during that process where you're deciding to clean house, bury the bobbies next door, make sure you know what you're doing, that's an area you need to look in the mirror and think about too, because that will kind of guide you as to the type of buyer you really are looking for.
Yeah. We always joke that the half-life of an entrepreneur post-acquisition, it's really a low number because it's very difficult to, especially, we've just seen recently that, companies that are the platform, now that principal, he has to report to private equity, he has to lead other bolt-on companies, he or she, and this is just new to them. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to go from sort of being the person that you don't have to be accountable to anybody to being the person that you're accountable to a number of stakeholders. It's a challenge.
Yeah, and Marty, it's worth also noting there is one other category, and that's independent sponsors. And independent sponsors are individuals who kind of act like private equity, investors, but they don't have a set fund behind them. They have a Rolodex of mostly these family offices or institutions who are looking to them to help build a strategy to go off and buy a platform company to execute on that strategy. And they're probably closer to a family office mentality. The independent sponsor supplements management and really works hand in hand with management and wants to like management, wants management to like them. So they're a good alternative also. Of course, investment bankers pull their hairs out when the independent sponsors show up because, the independent sponsor may or may not have the money fully locked down to make the bid, but they tend to make the seller feel a little more comfortable during the process. So it's an interesting
I had lunch with one yesterday. So it was, and they're sort of at the next stage where they're looking for their next liquidity event. They've got to get out too, right? So they're looking at private equity now as their exit after about a 5-year run as the independent.
Yeah, and they kind of that's right, Marty. They sit in between. They really do sit in between. They may be willing to hold them 5, 6, 7 years, depending upon where their money came from. Because if it's mailbox money, they're about that too.
That's right. Right. Hey, Bill, I want to kind of, we're sort of beginning to find the end of our time together. And when you and I spoke about this the other day, we talked to sort of like lessons learned, sort of best practices and failed ideas that you've seen in transactions. Maybe I can plant that seed with you to talk a little bit about as an operator of a company that's yet to sell, or as an operator of a platform that's adding on bolt-ons. What advice can you offer from your perspective on things that you've seen work really well, and then maybe an anecdote or so of what do you see failing?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've seen that's worked well is following the process, using an empirical set of metrics to drive the transaction. We actually I had a client not too long ago that I represented in a transaction, and we did a great job of kind of identifying the targets, going through diligence, and then prioritizing those targets. Well, the buyer actually started to get fairly enamored with one of the targets, and so we tended to focus and get a little deeper and a little more. We dug real deep in the diligence and the IT environment, and what popped out were a number of red flags. They were leadership-based, culture-based, financially based, technology-based, on every dimension. This was a deal that should never have happened. But he fell in love with this company. He fell in love with the facility. He fell in love with the assets. And we could not dissuade him from moving forward with that transaction, no matter what. So he went ahead and acquired this company. And unfortunately, 6 months later, they filed Chapter 11. Now, it's got, I guess what works is being fact-based, being empirical, and being unemotional about the deal. This is about the financial health of both organizations, and in particular, the buyer, who's got to take this asset and make something from it. If what you're doing is buying an emotion, it's a little bit like hugging a cloud. You're never going to get out of it what you need to get out of it. So I guess that's one of the lessons I've learned, that you've got to take emotion out of the deal and really drive a very fact-based, efficient process. And as George mentioned earlier, you can never start too early, right? So, you know, when we with startup organizations, we'll tell them, I'll ask, what's your exit strategy? Well, you're starting up. I want to know what's your exit. I mean, you've got to have a view of where you're going to take this organization. So start early, plan and execute flawlessly, and be empirical. Let the data drive the decisions and not the emotions.
Got it. Hey, George, I don't want the hour to slip by and you and I not talk about sort of the dominant market segment in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. That's kind of the GovCon sector. I like to tell folks that pre 9/11, I was out trying to do a leveraged MBO and I was trying to raise capital, and people were valuing our company at about 2 or 3 times earnings at that time. And life's changed a little bit since then. I know I've gotten older, but valuations have gotten a lot higher. Why is this market so attractive? And you know, what's going on there that makes it such an attractive target for private equity? Is knee deep in it. Strategics have kind of known their space for a long time, but private equity, maybe it's the 3rd generation past Carlyle and Arlington that have continued to build companies. What's going on in this marketplace?
I mean, I think across the board, there's so much money that needs to get deployed, and people just want to get it deployed. That's driving valuations everywhere, not only in GovCon, but across the board. You know, frankly, in GovCon, I mean, you can just read the paper every day. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, you know, what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, NATO, you know, that's got people spooked. Anything that touches military is red hot. Anything that touches aerospace, red hot. You know, cybersecurity is enormous. I mean, you know, anything that touches cybersecurity in the private sector as well as in government affairs, I mean, it's we all need it. I mean, I think what we're seeing in part is a shift that's been ongoing for quite some time, but, you know, really starting to pick up more and more speed in recognizing, like, this is a predominant industry for us because we have not, as a nation and as businesses, really taken it seriously up until about 5-6 years ago. Yeah. Like, you know, it was always out there. There were startups, there were companies being done. Yeah, it looks great. We got to do it. All it took was 3 or 4 booms. And now everybody's like, oh, wait a minute, we got to get our act together. And, you know, there's a lot of talent, specifically in the Mid-Atlantic region. There's an unbelievable amount of talent due to the NSA, you know, Washington, D.C., Northrop Grumman, and all the other gigantic, you know, government contractors that charge us $800 for a wrench. So what's coming out of these organizations are new ideas, new thoughts, new things to do. And I think through that, you know, everybody's rushing and pushing as hard as they can to make it happen. GovCon is an enormous umbrella, okay, over a variety of industries. I mean, you could be on the GSA schedule for T-shirts, and you have predominantly, you're providing, you know, the wheels for Apache helicopters. You're a GovCon, you're in government contracting. You could be doing DOE work. You could be doing cybersecurity, networking, hard asset monitoring. That's all government affairs related corporate contracting. Yeah. It's a very broad area. For years, people did not do business with the federal government. They didn't do business with the state governments unless they were really large. What people have discovered is they're good customers. Yeah. You just have to know how to navigate them and work with them, including managing, as we talked about earlier, your intellectual property, because there's a whole slew of rules that get kicked into play when you're touching intellectual property. But the great thing, is that, it's a market with a lot of potential, a lot of diversity, which I think is terrific, and it's an area that is pretty much facts and circumstances. Going to Bill's comment before, try to take emotion out. I mean, to be blunt, in my line of work, I'm telling you right now, every seller's emotional. Forget it. I don't care. Every seller's emotional. It's their baby. They raised him. They raised her. It's moving forward. There's going to be some emotion. It's the end of an era. It's the end of a way of life for an individual entrepreneur. You have to recognize that in your negotiations and be sensitive to that. And the really successful buyer takes that into account, that you really need to step lightly around the personal aspect and stick to the facts and work with them through the facts. But human nature brings personalities and emotions all the time. So, I think as the markets get hotter and move quicker, you're going to see a lot more entrepreneurs, a lot more sellers, a lot more buyers. You're going to get a lot more diversity to who's selling and who's buying. And that's going to bring a lot more diversity of personalities. So fact-based negotiations are going to be preeminent, and have a psychologist on staff.
Well, to your point on quality of earnings, just the accuracy of the data, the pre-deal planning that you both spoke of on both the buyer side, the acquirer side, and the sell side. It can't happen too early, but it's never too late. I think that's probably something we can walk away from. Bill, anything you want to do share it just as we begin to wrap up our time together?
Well, I noticed that Tara had a question in there about kind of in response to the emotions and taking the emotions out. And you're right, Tara, intuition, I view intuition as the combination of analytics and experience. And your gut tells you that this is something good to pursue or it's not good to pursue. So yeah, I think intuition does play a role, but you do have to be governed. And as George says, these are emotional because this could be a third, fourth, fifth, seventh generation business. It's very much been a part of your family, and it's how you identify. So there's going to be emotion attached to it, but the decisions should be fact-based. Recognizing there is emotion, the decisions should be fact-based, and that's the point I was trying to make.
I couldn't agree with you more, but I actually have a white paper on my desk right now that my boss Charlie wrote, called "The Emotions of a Deal." So we're going to post that in the next week or so. So I think I'll add to that, George. Get a psychologist on staff. Bill Lenihan, it was a pleasure to have you on board. Thank you and Hartman Advisors for your role today. George Nemphos.
Thanks for having me, Marty.
So happy to play a small role in you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with the audience and everybody here. If there's any questions you have, you can feel free to shoot them to the chat. We'll continue to monitor them and get back to you if you have any questions that we can answer.
No, Marty, thank you, Marty, for taking the time today. Great job, Bill. Terrific having a conversation with you.
My pleasure.
Likewise,
Indeed.
George.
That's exactly what it was.